If I can have your attention, please, perhaps we'll get started. In the interest of time, we probably don't have a full hour for this presentation, so I think we can get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the concurrent sessions on road safety. My name is Chris O'Connell, and I'm the Registrar of Motor Vehicles for the province of New Brunswick and the board member of CCMTA for the province of New Brunswick. And I have the distinct pleasure this afternoon of being the moderator for this session. So the following presentation will last approximately 50 minutes or so. We hope we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So if you could hold your questions to the very end, that'd be most appreciated. So the name of our presentation this afternoon is CanDrive, a national prospective study of older drivers. And we're very fortunate to discuss this topic to have two co-presenters today. So firstly, the first presenter, Mark Rappoport, is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and clinical scientist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. Dr. Rappoport is also a member of the Canadian Driving Research Initiative for Vehicular Safety in the Elderly, or CanDrive. He's also an associate editor of the Canadian Journal of Geriatrics and the president of the Canadian Academy of Geriatric Psychiatry, or CAGP. He's the chair of the National Review Course in Geriatric Psychiatry and the CAGP Online Geriatric Psychiatry Study Group. Dr. Rappoport received his medical degree from McMaster University and subsequently trained in psychiatry at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on the topics of traumatic brain injury in the elderly and the risk of motor vehicle collisions associated with neurological and psychiatric diseases and their treatments. Our other presenter is Gary Naglie, Chief, Department of Medicine with Baycrest Health Sciences and professor in the Department of Medicine and Institute of Health Policy with the University of Toronto. Dr. Naglie received his medical degree from McGill University, specialty training in geriatric medicine at the University of Toronto, and graduate training in clinical epidemiology at McMaster University. He is a professor in the Department of Medicine and Institute of Health Policy, Management, and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, and he holds the Hunt Family Chair in Geriatric Medicine. He's the Chief of Medicine at Baycrest and is a scientist at Baycrest Rotman Research Institute and at the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute. His research focuses on outcomes evaluation and quality of life in cognitively impaired and medically complex older adults. Dr. Naglie is a member of CanDrive, a national team of researchers interested in driving safety in older adults, and he has a particular interest in driving capacity in persons with cognitive impairment. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Mark Rappoport and Gary Naglie.
Well, thank you very much for the nice introduction, and I'm pleased to be here today to speak to the CCMTA about CanDrive, and you'll hear today that CanDrive is really a research group that encapsulates a number of different studies, and we'll try to highlight some of those studies for you today. I'll give a brief introduction to begin with, and then I'll turn it over to Gary, who will describe the core CanDrive study and some of the preliminary findings, and then to conclude, I'll talk about some offshoot studies that we're working on. Here are some disclosures of where our funding comes from. There are no industry funds that come to either of us, but the money for the various research projects that we do comes from the sources listed on the slide. I've given you a bit of the introduction already. CanDrive itself is a CIHR-funded network of driving researchers that started in 2002 with its funding, and we just had our most recent renewal in 2014. It's netted a total of $8.2 million of research funding from the CIHR. We are here as representatives of CanDrive, but we are the Toronto site leaders of the CanDrive project. The two main leaders are in Ottawa, Sean Marshall and Malcolm Manson-Hing, and the rest of the investigators really represent researchers from across the country. We have researchers, seniors groups, clinicians, ministries of transportation, other governmental and non-governmental organizations that advise and are stakeholders and help work with these projects. The vision of CanDrive is to establish a national interdisciplinary collaborative approach to help identify, analyze, and address the health-related safety and quality of life issues pertaining to older drivers. The main objective of what we'll hear about today, the cohort study, is to develop a scientifically valid, easy-to-use clinical decision rule that will identify safe older drivers or those that need to go on for further testing. And the goal is to extend the safe driving period for older persons. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Naglie, who will describe that cohort study in some more detail.
Thank you very much, Mark. Chris, thank you for that very nice introduction. And Jeff in the back, thank you for your audiovisual assistance. Much appreciated. I'm going to focus on the common cohort, but we'll also present some of the other studies that CanDrive is doing and then give you some preliminary results. So the centerpiece of the CanDrive research is the common cohort study. The objective is to conduct a comprehensive longitudinal study of older drivers to identify key factors that impact their driving safety. And as you'll see, many of the other studies relate to this common cohort. And as Mark alluded to, a central aspect related to the common cohort is the study that's focusing on developing an evidence-based clinical decision rule for healthcare professionals that's going to have a high positive predictive value to identify drivers who are at increased risk for at-fault motor vehicle crashes. One of the other studies which will use the participants in the common cohort is going to be using passive GPS monitoring to prospectively examine driving patterns of older drivers in relationship to health, to climate, and personal description of their driving patterns as well as driving outcomes. We're also collecting a variety of psychosocial questionnaires. So one of the other studies is looking to examine the role of psychosocial factors on driving-related decisions, functional behavior, and performance. We also have a couple of studies that aren't specifically related to the common cohort. One of these is studying factors that influence older drivers when purchasing a vehicle and trying to develop a vehicle design rating system that could help act as an educational material for older drivers when they're purchasing a new vehicle. Another area of focus relates to simulators, and the specific study is aimed at validating a simulator assessment for older drivers and how this can translate into use in clinical settings. So we're going to spend most of our time focusing, as we said, on the common cohort study, and we've included and recruited a convenient sample of drivers 70 years of age and older who had an expected life expectancy of 5 years or greater, because we have anticipated following them for at least 5 years with a general Class 5 driver's license, and the participants have to have access to a vehicle and drive at least once a week. In terms of exclusions, an absolute contraindication to driving as defined by the Canadian Medical Association guidelines is an exclusion, and this was identified when we initially screened our participants. So we've recruited participants from 7 Canadian city sites at 4 provinces. This includes Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia, and we've recruited 928 older drivers from those different sites. These are drivers 70 and older. We also have sites in Australia and New Zealand, so we recruited an additional 257 participants from Melbourne, Australia, and 45 from Wellington, New Zealand, and these are drivers 75 years of age and older. We're conducting comprehensive annual assessments. These assessments include physical, sensory, and cognitive assessments, as well as questionnaires about driving habits and behaviors. And as mentioned, we have a variety of psychosocial questionnaires that we're also administering. We also conduct follow-ups at 4 and 8 months Those time periods, we're reviewing the driving record, overall health status, self-reported collisions, and also actually collecting our SD cards that have the driving exposure information that we'll speak about shortly. So we have Precentic GPS devices that are attached to the computer of the vehicle, and in this photograph, you can actually see the device, which is tucked away safely behind the pedals so that they don't interfere with the driving. We also came up with a fix for the fact that many households may have multiple drivers, so our participant is given a key fob that can be recognized and allows us to identify which of the driving on that vehicle was conducted by one of our participants. We've collected over 20 million kilometers of data to date. We clearly have the largest, I think, international collection of driving data on older drivers that we will be spending probably years assessing. In terms of information that we're collecting from our provincial licensing bodies, we are receiving all of the crash data and data about traffic violations. And in terms of assigning at-fault status, we have 2 experts that are reviewing all of the data that's provided to us to come to a conclusion as to whether collisions were considered at fault or not at fault by the participant. With respect to analysis, our primary outcome is at-fault collisions, which are going to be adjusted per kilometer driven. Secondary outcomes relate to self-reported collisions and driving violations. And overall, our objective is to find the best combinations of predictor variables for these particular outcomes. So I'm going to give you some very preliminary results. What I want to point out up front is that the 3-year data is incomplete with respect to this particular analysis, and that's why you'll see that some of the numbers in year 3 differ from those in years 1 and year 2. So we can see that the mean age of the drivers is about 76, and of course, as we move into later years, this increases. And in general, we're talking about 62% of the drivers are male. As is often the case with studies, I guess, unfortunately, is participants tend to be highly educated. And this is certainly true in our study. And as you could see, only a small proportion just have a high school or lesser education, with the majority having education beyond high school, and a large number with university degrees and postgraduate education. With respect to employment status, the majority are indeed unemployed, as one might expect. We do have a significant proportion that are involved in volunteer work. So if we look at number of medical conditions over the course of time, what we can see as we anticipated, that the number of medical conditions is increasing over time, which will be important in terms of our data and understanding how medical conditions influence driving outcomes. But I'm going to point out this column to you for all of the subsequent slides that I'm showing, and what I want to point out is the significant heterogeneity with a large range in all the values for the different variables that we look at. This is not unexpected. One of the most consistent features of an older cohort is how heterogeneous they are. And that's important for us in terms of course, identifying predictors of various driving outcomes. In terms of number of current medications, the average is about 5, but again, there's a wide range. We have 2 tests of physical performance, a timed up and go test, which times someone standing up from a chair, walking 10 feet, returning and sitting down. The mean was about 10. Values less than 10 are considered to be consistent with robust older adults. Again, we see a wide range with some people well into the range of people requiring tremendous assistance with physical mobility. The rapid pace walk test is being used as well. There's been studies that have shown that people who take greater than 9 seconds have about a 3.5-fold increased risk of crash. And as you can see, the mean is about 6.5. But again, when you look at the range, we clearly have participants that are extreme in terms of taking a much longer period and probably being at higher risk. This is some of the cognitive functioning results. And we have the Trails Making B test, both the time to complete the test, the number of errors, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, and the mini mental state scores. Now, when you look at the mean scores, they generally fall within a normal range. But again, what I point out is the extreme ranges that you find. So to complete the trails making, generally if it's more than 180 seconds, you may have some concerns. The mean is well below that, but clearly there are many people that would fall above that. The MOCA test, there's some controversy. We'll use cutoff scores of 26 or 23. The average was basically in or close to the normal range, but again, we have a wide range of scores. And again, the mini mental state score of 28 would be within a normal range, but we do have people falling in the lower 20s. These are our crash data, incomplete for year 3. So the first couple years we had about 35 crashes in the cohort, and as you could see, just under 50% were at fault. The year 3 data is incomplete. Clearly, this is a much higher at fault rate or proportion. It's too early to tell whether, when we have the full data, whether that will play out. We also get convictions data, and we do have some variability across the years, but what's quite consistent is by far and away the greatest conviction is for speeding, and then the next two highest but much lower proportions are road sign violation and road rule violations. Now this is a teaser. We're looking at univariate predictors of at-fault motor vehicle crashes. I'll point out this is only based on 27 at-fault crashes, so of course doesn't include all of our data to date. And we've masked the actual variables because it's early and we don't want to give any misleading information. So we just called things like psychosocial variable 1 and 2, physical variable 1 and 2. We have a vision variable and an overall health variable. All of these variables, when we compared no at-fault crash versus at-fault crash, there were significant differences between the groups. So these were variables that predicted differences between the groups. So the important message is, as we know, driving involves multiple aspects: sensory function, cognitive function, physical function, and we think that these multiple variables all in different ways can contribute to crash, and these early results seem to support that, and we'll look forward to being able to present our complete data hopefully within about a couple of years. So I'm very quickly going to run through some of the cross-sectional results that we've come across to date. So here we're looking at men versus women. So men were more comfortable driving during the day and during the night. Older versus younger drivers. Older drivers reported less comfort while driving, poorer perceptions of their driving ability, more concerns about their driving, perceptions that others hold negative views about their driving, and a likelihood that they would be less likely to continue driving. When we looked at participants with slower time to complete the trail making test A and B, so it took longer for them to be able to complete this test, they reported lower levels of driving comfort and ability and reported more avoidance in difficult driving situations. And the MMSC and the Montreal Cognitive Assessment were not associated at the cross-sectional analysis with drivers' perceived comforts, abilities, or restrictions, of course pointing out that in general the MOCA scores were in the normal range, and possibly as we follow the cohort and have people with more cognitive impairment that we may see a change in this regard. In terms of those who had greater perceived health and visual capacity, they tended to have greater day and night driving comfort, better perceptions of their driving ability, and a longer intent to continue driving. When we looked at participants driving less than 5,000 kilometers a year, they tended to report more than double the rate of crashes per kilometer driven and had lower scores on cognitive, physical, and sensory measures. So I'm just going to bring you up to date to where we're at right now. We're in the phase of completing our 5th year of follow-up. And the Winnipeg cohort had to close in September 2013 because of some changes in the reporting at the provincial level, but the sites in Montreal, Ottawa, Victoria, Toronto, Thunder Bay, and Hamilton continue to run, and we plan, based on a recent grant that we received, to continue following this cohort until December 2016. We've published a series of articles based on our cross-sectional analyses in Accident Analysis and Prevention, volume 61, 2013, and we're currently just completing the drafting of a series of manuscripts that will be published in an upcoming issue in the Canadian Journal on Aging. Oops. So I'm going to pass things back to Mark.
Thank you. Just take this one.
Oh, this is the
okay.
advancer. This is the laser.
Sure, thank you. So thank you, Gary. I have two offshoot studies to tell you about that came out of this work that started with CanDrive. The first is called Dementia and Driving in Ontario, DADIO. Now, we chose to do this particular study in Ontario simply because of the unique wording of the Highway Traffic Act. The purpose of the study was to get consensus among Ontario's key expert leaders in dementia on how the Ontario Highway Traffic Act legislation should be applied in the real world in specific clinical scenarios of patients who have mild cognitive impairment and mild Alzheimer's disease. We didn't feel we needed to study moderate dementia, severe dementia. These patients have conditions that are clear-cut contraindications to driving, so we wanted to study the gray area cases. So as of 1992, about 250,000 of Canadians over the age of 65 had Alzheimer's disease, and the number expected to rise dramatically over time. The crash rates in dementia are 2 to 8 times higher than in age-matched controls, and between 22 and 64% of patients with dementia continue to drive, and often for many years. The Ontario Act makes it mandatory for us physicians in Ontario to report medically unfit drivers. And this is why I got interested in the topic of driving in the elderly. Many physicians don't report these patients because the guidelines are unclear or because the doctors are just uncomfortable with them. There's a lot of disruption to the doctor-patient relationship. There's a goal of keeping our patients autonomous and happy. And there's no consensus previously published on which patients in this gray area should be reported. Brown in Washington University conducted the Washington University road test on a series of patients with dementia, and he asked the patients to rate whether they thought they were going to pass, their family members, so an informant, and their physician, this expert physician who examined them, to rate in advance whether they would pass the Washington University road test. And you could see here that the participants themselves were not good at predicting whether they were going to pass or fail, pretty much about chance. Their family member was somewhat better, and the physician was the best, but you could see he was wrong a quarter of the time. And this was John Morris, this physician who did these studies, and he's one of the world's leading expert on mild Alzheimer's disease. So if he was wrong 1 in 4, I'm sure I would be wrong much more than that. So in this study that I'll describe, we gave physicians a series of 26 case scenarios. All of them looked somewhat similar. They all had a working differential diagnosis of mild Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, and we varied some of the variables. So in this, this is one particular case of the 26. So in this particular case, the patient had no crashes. Their caregiver looked like this when they were discussing the idea about them driving. They were very concerned about their driving abilities. They were slow when they did cognitive testing. They had become irritable over time. And when asked to draw a clock drawing test and put the numbers on a clock to set the time at 10 minutes after 11, they produced that figure. We asked in all of these case scenarios whether they would report to the Ministry of Transportation and whether they would suggest a specialized on-road test and some combination of that. In that particular case, where there were a lot of problems except for crashes, most of the doctors said that they would report to the Ministry of Transportation. They were a little bit mixed about whether they would recommend a road test, but most of the doctors who saw that scenario suggested an MTO report, but there was quite a degree of variability between the physicians and between the different types of cases. In fact, female physicians seem to be much less likely than male physicians overall to report patients, so that was an interesting finding. And when we looked at the patient-related factors, the combination of an abnormal clock and caregiver concern accounted for a good deal of the variance, 62% of the variance in reporting to the Ministry of Transportation whether or not a road test was included. So that helped us come up with some ideas about how to guide physicians in this very challenging area. What we're doing right now with this model, and I've just given you the highlights of the model, we've put it into an algorithm, and the algorithm is being put into a computerized decision support system, which we're about to test among another group of different experts in dementia, family physicians and specialists, and we're going to see whether that computerized decision aid helps increase appropriate reporting of these patients to the Ministry of Transportation. We're just in the process of finalizing the computerized algorithm. We've had some technical glitches along the way, but we'll be launching hopefully within the month. At the same time, I know the CCMTA has been instrumental in creating guidelines for assessing drivers with medical illness, along with the Canadian Medical Association. So my group, I've been an author in the latest edition, this one here, the 8th edition of the CMA Driver's Guide. And when I got invited to be an author, I was given about a month, or maybe even 2 weeks, to write the section to update the section on dementia with Frank Molnar. And I thought, this is not a great process. I wonder if we could do this in a more rigorous fashion. So I applied for a grant to identify and establish a driver's medical fitness knowledge synthesis team. So a team of experts and authors, researchers and stakeholders who could put their heads together to plan to enhance the quality of the CMA Driver's Guide. What we did first is we wanted to see what is the quality of what's out there already. We did a detailed search of computerized databases, and we looked for national level driver's guidelines across the world. We identified none using the bibliographic databases that we use usually in scientific research. All of them were found through Google. We identified 9 individual national level driver's guidelines. And I'm just going to show you what we thought of the quality of these. Now, it wasn't just me and a few colleagues in Toronto analyzing this. We had some international, we had a team of international experts rate each guideline. Each of the guidelines was rated by 8 individual experts. So you could see that if you put about 3.5 as a pass, you could see that most of them were above pass, but their quality out of 7 was not that high. 3 of them didn't meet the pass rate. Only one of them, the Australian guideline, was recommended for implementation immediately. One of them was not recommended at all, the Singapore guideline, and the rest of them were somewhat intermediate, recommended with modifications, or a split between don't recommend and recommend with modifications. When we looked at the details of why we thought the quality was not that great, there were some areas of strength. So first, to celebrate what was done right, the scope and purpose was reasonably clearly described across all these guidelines. This is a guideline to help physicians assess drivers with medical illness. Stakeholder involvement, usually there were specialists from ophthalmology, cardiology, the different views. That was not bad. Clarity of presentation, they were fairly clear and easy to read, user-friendly. But here's where the weaknesses lay. The applicability, so they make all these good recommendations, but how do we apply it in practice? The rigor of development, how scientific was the process of coming up with these recommendations? And the editorial independence, what sources of funding were there that went into it, and so forth. So those were areas of weakness. And when we asked the group to rank what are the most important aspects if we were to fix the CMA guide for future editions, rigor came out number 1, which is what I had suspected. I didn't want to lead this based on my opinion. I wanted to look at the international leaders' ideas about this. But rigor of development is something that we can and will take forward to the next step. So we just met in Ottawa with some representatives. Paul Bose was there of Transport Canada and the CCMTA. and we had a discussion about next steps and strengthening this. And the plan is going to be to draw on our international collaborations to conduct very careful, detailed, high-quality knowledge syntheses and move them together in a more rigorous way to build better national-level guidelines through international collaborations in the future. For both Gary and I wanted to list all of the people who've helped us on the CanDrive team. This is a listing of in the middle is just a listing of some of the research associates who joined us from the beginning, but there are many more that helped along the way. We have co-investigators from across the country and even those in Australia and New Zealand who were instrumental in some of this work. And the partners are listed here. It would take me too long to read them out, but I'll leave them up on the slide during the question period to see if anyone has any questions for Dr. Naglie and I. Thank you. There's a question.
In the study that you were talking about, you said that you chose drivers that had a 5-year life expectancy so that you could do that longitudinal study. Did that skew the data towards a kind of healthier cohort of drivers? Sorry, can you hear what I said?
Could you, I think they're recording, so can you repeat your question, if you don't mind?
In the study that you were describing, you had said that in choosing your sample, you'd chosen drivers who had a 5-year life expectancy so that you could do the longitudinal study. And what I wondered whether that skewed the study towards a population that was sort of healthier than the norm, or whether that mattered or not.
Well, it certainly does matter because ultimately generalizability of the sample will be important. So the short answer is to a degree it does skew, because if we took people who had short life expectancies, they'd be more ill. The problem we'd have with people like that is how much driving would they actually be doing, and they may well have their license suspended in a very short period of time after starting the study. So the notion was more to have a group that may, at the start of the study, be a relatively healthy older cohort, but by virtue of following them for 5 years, that many of them during the course of the follow-up would be developing various chronic conditions that could impact on their driving. So that was the rationale. We have done some work. Sylvain Gagnon, one of our CanDrive investigators in Ottawa, has done some intensive work trying to look at the population in CanDrive versus more representative samples. And the data that he's put together to date suggests, in fact, that our group was relatively representative. We were actually quite pleased to look at those data. But clearly, we have not included people who were in the process of dying or may have had more extreme conditions. And it's always a bit of a trade-off in studies like this about what we're going to do. But hopefully that answers your question.
And if I could also elaborate from a cognitive perspective, you saw Dr. Naglie showed the means and standard deviations of the cognitive function. They're all super cognitively intact at baseline, year 1, year 2. So although there is some variability, so it is important to look also at cognitively impaired cohorts and look at how they change over time. But that's outside of the main CanDrive study and more in the purview of the second study that I mentioned.
During your study, was there any thought given to like the environment that the drivers were in? Maybe city versus rural, winter, summer?
Yes, thank you for that excellent question. Michelle Porter, who's the lead investigator that's looking at analyzing the driving data, has already done some great work. So we are able to, through a lot of effort, link the dates and times in the various locations with weather forecasts. So we are able to look at issues about day versus night driving, climatic conditions, and of course we have information of whether they're on 400 highways or on city driving, and of course through the GPS and location we know if it's more rural or city driving. So we plan to examine all those data, but thank you for the question.
But it also speaks to one of the limitations, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the sites, in fact, all of the sites are university centers. So by definition, they're more, in order to get to the site, participants tended to be closer to the urban areas. So we don't have great overall representation of rural participants. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, there's a microphone coming.
One of the things, Gary, that you show on the slide is on average, seniors have about 5 different medication at the same time, and some of them may have 13 medication. Do we know whether this has impact on their score, for example, in the trail making test or MOCA, rather than it's a cognitive problem? It's the impact of that 5 or 13 medication at the same time that may affect their score.
Yeah, I mean, so you're asking a good question, and I guess depends a bit what you're interested in. If we're interested in looking at whether cognitive scores predict crash or driving performance, then the mediator of that isn't necessarily what's most important to identify relationships between cognition and driving. You're asking, of course, a deeper question. We have very rich data that we can look at a variety of things to try to understand how various factors interact with each other. We know from the literature that there are various medications that clearly do influence cognitive performance, people's level of alertness, et cetera, that could impact on driving. So again, this is going to be an extremely rich data set that will certainly take me well past my retirement and may take Mark through to his retirement. But these are types of questions with rich data that we have that we can start exploring. So it's a very good question. And we're going to have to, when we're looking at predictors, we will be using multivariable analyses that will be adjusting for various factors. So some of that will come out through those adjustments, looking at factors that strongly correlate with each other. So we certainly have to do that level of exploration in terms of looking at the important predictors.
First of all, kudos for the work that you've done. I haven't seen anything this comprehensive on senior drivers in a long time, so kudos to you. But I have more like maybe some advice that maybe you could help me with. And one of the things that I think your data actually may even support is, for example, in my state, every time we start having this conversation about maybe additional regulations for senior drivers, the response, and the very strong response that we keep getting back is, well, these are the most self-regulated folks that we have. So I was wondering, I know you can't answer the question, but it seems like some of the information that you have in your study actually kind of supports their argument there. So what do you think?
So if I could address the notion of self-regulation, Dr. Naglie showed one of the studies from Michelle Porter that showed that those who really self-regulate a lot, so less than, I think it was 5,000 kilometers a year, they had very high crash rates. So self-regulation is good, but it may actually be a signal that they're self-regulating maybe not enough. Maybe they're self-regulating compared to the average older driver. They're driving much less, but that lack of practice, maybe because they have an illness that's affecting their drive and they know about it and they're adapting a bit to it, but perhaps not enough to avoid crashes. So that's one potential thing to consider.
Yeah, so I would just add, I think there is ample evidence that although older drivers tend to self-regulate to a much greater extent than younger drivers, that in terms of their ability to identify whether they're safe or unsafe and should stop driving, the evidence suggests that they're not very good at that. And one of my personal areas of interest, and Mark's as well, is cognitive impairment and dementia, and the loss of insight that tends to be associated with people who have a decline in cognition is particularly concerning. So they actually may be a group of drivers that are least likely, or certainly less likely, to appropriately self-regulate. And Mark's point is really important. I mean, I view when I interview patients that they're driving less than 5,000 kilometers a year, one of the things I'm starting to think about is this just a marker of someone who has various cognitive, physical, sensory disabilities that yes, they're self-regulating, but is that, you know, it just takes one trip on the road to end up with a fatal crash. So, you know, self-regulation is good to a certain extent, but I don't think it solves this problem. But thank you for the question.
Dave Barry, I think, said that there's a shared delusion. One of the realities of everyone in society is that everyone feels they're an above average driver. So at a population level, if you think about that, so the idea of insight, without dementia, we all think that we're above average. Nobody thinks that at least that they're a below average driver. So you take away insight, and with a dementing disorder, that becomes even more significant.
Another interesting tidbit, actually, is the literature comparing men versus women drivers. So, you know, women, in fact, may tend in general to, as we've pointed out, to have less confidence in their driving. And we suspect that there are older women who stop driving unnecessarily, and that an area where we need to put a bit more focus is trying to look at older women drivers to try to look at ways to perhaps support their confidence when they remain safe drivers. So it can work both ways. You have people who may over-restrict when they don't have to, and ultimately that may be a bad thing because they're not exposed, for example, to driving on, you know, highway driving, and if the situation arises, they feel uncomfortable, and that can cause problems. So it's an interesting question.
I do think we have a couple more minutes if there's somebody holding on with the question back there. Going once, going twice, okay. Well, thank you for your participation, and I hope you enjoyed today's session. As you know, we'll be breaking for coffee with the exhibitors for the next 30 minutes. And there are other concurrent road safety sessions starting at 4:30, so please consult your program for the details about that. And I wanted to close by saying, on behalf of CCMTA, I'd like to thank Gary and Mark for an extremely informative presentation, and I wish I could take notes and look the slides at the same time, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Nice job. We appreciate it. Very nice to meet you. How are you?
Fine.
All good? How are you?
Good. I just wanted to tell you guys.
Thanks, Jeff.
Put the logo back up.
Okay.
Well, I'll just so you can repeat it if you find it funny enough. A colleague of mine, his grandmother was in her 80s, and he had a schizophrenia. She lost control, took the ditch, ended up in a hayfield, and she was driving around the hayfield. And then somebody who knew her stopped by and said, "What are you doing?" She says, "I'm looking for the exit."
Ouch. At least she didn't hurt herself, thankfully, but oh my God.
I did have two more questions, but I do want to hog question time. Is it possible that the difference between men and women is that women have a more accurate self-assessment? As in so many other areas of life.
But there is some literature that suggests that women underestimate. The concern is, so the concern is there may be some,
They're restricting themselves where they don't need to.
stop driving.